I was bullied in school for being dark-skinned.
My distinct memories from class 6, 7, and 8 were being ostracized at birthday parties, and I even remember being hit by a shoe once.
Direct consequences of bullying, full-blown syndrome of clinical depression.
Over 40% kids have admitted to being bullied in some form or the other in India. Bullying is not just about making fun of someone, their appearance, how they talk, or what they wear, or their background. When the victim remains unaffected by the situation, it's often ignored. But if the victim is affected and suffers physical, emotional, or psychological distress, it's time to take notice. Also, when does ragging turn into bullying, really? That is offensive and harmful and prompts the victim into contemplating suicide even. What are the long-term psychological impacts of bullying? And what should schools, colleges, teachers, parents, and peer groups do? Aditya Kapur went to school in Delhi. He was bullied for being really good at studies. I'm very happy to have him join this chat because he went on to become head boy, do exceptionally well at academics, and is now with an Ivy League college in the US. Brown University, studying mathematics, economics, and history. I wonder what the bullies have to say to that. And also joining me is Dr. Amit Sen, Psychiatrist and Director of Children First. I know for a fact that your organization is doing some path-breaking work with troubled children. Thank you both very much for joining me on Zen-Brain. Aditya, let's get right to it. What was the bullying like for you? Tell us.
Thank you so much for having this session. The bullying really started in middle school. It's called a few names, and there were a few violent incidents over the few years. And most of this, as you already mentioned, was due to doing well in academics, and these sort of jealousies that start cropping up, especially like when people start getting competitive around this age. And I mean, my distinct memories from class 6, 7, and 8 were being ostracized at birthday parties, being isolated in school, name calling, starting from something such as nerd to even like explicit words. And I even remember being hit by a shoe once. That was probably the most violent incident I remember. So things like this really did start. And by the end of class 6, 7, 8, I was just left with a handful of friends, which definitely made me more socially awkward, looking more socially inwards. And I told my parents, and of course, they were very supportive. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do inside school as parents. And they could support me at home, but there's not much that they could do at school. And I did tell my teachers, but at the end of the day, beyond these sort of non-punishment approaches, talking to children, telling them not to bully, there was nothing much that they could, like pull up the children as well. It did take a toll on me that, the name calling just progressed into this sort of social isolation and ostracization over time.
Doc, let me turn to you. How do you respond when you hear something like this? And it's fairly common, right, Doc?
Yes, indeed. Bullying, as you said, that 40 to 50% of kids in Indian schools report some sort of bullying, whether it be physical, emotional, social, and now with, of course, social media and what have you. Bullying by definition and by nature is damaging, right? And indeed, when I get to hear somebody like Aditya, who has been so successful, I'm in admiration that you could actually overcome some of those years of bullying, because bullying can have very deep-seated impact in your psyche, in the way you view yourself, in the way you negotiate with the world after that. Your self-esteem and confidence can come down in a big way. So you clearly have been able to surmount all that, Aditya. So congratulations for that. And
Thank you.
And also, of course, I think it's such a relevant topic, Shruti, that you've chosen. So thank you for doing this today.
Thank you very much. That's why we need to have this discussion because 40 to 50% of the kids go through it. There are many, many, many kids who don't really know who to discuss this with. I'm really surprised and shocked, in fact, to hear that you were hit by a shoe. What did it do to your psyche?
It definitely shakes you up. And I mean, humans are social beings, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. At some point, as a child, you want to feel like you belong in a social group or in a social surrounding, especially in your school. And for me, the school was sort of like my primary place to interact with people. So definitely you want to feel belonged in a certain place. And I was definitely shocked, startled that why were these competitive jealousies, coming into place in the first place? I never did anything wrong to anyone to face these consequences in the first place. It definitely shakes you up. You want to tell people, especially your elders. But I mean, I've been noticing recently that even schools have started taking a more, I won't say complacent, but a sort of a laissez-faire approach where they're like, we're going to educate children about it. And, not exactly tell them not to bully, but just that, be nice to people and these sort of positive approaches, whereas without explaining the negative dimensions of bullying. And I think that's a really important thing to educate people about in the first place, so as to bring them onto the right track. I think that's one, because at the end of the day, bullying does start with some sort of insecurity on the bully's part. So how do we deal with those insecurities first? How do we deal with it at the root cause? I think that's something that schools really need to discuss and sort of like put into place, that how do we deal with these sort of insecurities stemming out from bullies, where they take out their anger or their sadness or whatever at someone else.
Doc, how do you respond to that?
Wow. I think that that's a very nuanced and layered understanding of bullying, Aditya. Indeed, there are various aspects of it as to why would a bully become a bully, right? How do you address it in a social system? That we are indeed social beings, and there is, a need to belong socially to a group, to a family, and that need, particularly during adolescent years, becomes very, very strong indeed. In fact, it goes into the formation of identity through those very crucial and sensitive years. And indeed, during that time, if a person goes to bullying in a systematic way over a period of time, then you can imagine how some of the core developmental issues will get affected, such as emotional and social development, isn't it? Yeah. And of course, your sense of self. And that can have long-lasting impact on the choices that you make in life, on the relationships you forge later. Yeah. So to start with, again, if we want to understand why does bullying happen in the first place, you're right that many bullies have had difficult life experiences themselves. Perhaps they have got bullied at home or in other spaces, or maybe earlier in school and then turned bullies themselves later. They can carry a sense of inadequacy, which then translates into this kind of aggressive behavior towards other to feel good themselves. That's one way of looking at bullying. But some of the research that has happened over the last couple of decades has also pointed out to the fact that all bullies are not people who have felt like victims or have low self-esteem. Indeed, some of them actually come from homes where there is a very sort of strict hierarchy, perhaps, and they have seen people, particularly male members of the family, establishing their dominance through kind of aggressive behaviors, and that is legitimized. And once that happens, then the young person feels that it's okay to do that, right? And when they are growing up and they want to kind of have a good sense of self and develop self-confidence, then they think there's no harm in doing this kind of a thing. And indeed, the peer community, also begins to, particularly if they're bystanders and not responding or reacting to this, begin to support it. And many such bullies are thought to be as cool people who are powerful, who are, who know what they're doing. They're confident people. And, in many schools, you will find a bunch of kids who may be pretty good in what they do in certain fields, and they're confident kids, and yet they resort to bullying because that, kind of upholds their social status in many ways, So there are, a different, so the eventual act of bullying can emerge from different spaces and different dynamics in the mind, and some can, as you said, be victims who have turned bullies, and there are others who have seen this pattern and they don't think there's anything wrong with it. And in that context, it becomes vital, as you said, Aditya, to help people understand the negative consequences of bullying. Because, the bullies don't ever really think deeply about what the victim goes through. They don't think that they might become suicidal. They don't think that, or they don't know sometimes that the effect will actually hamper their lives, hamper their mental health, their confidence, their career choices in years to come. And if indeed those kids, the bullies, knew that, maybe that will begin to change their perspective and approach in any case. So I've dealt with many such young people who, when they were questioned, and they were the leaders in school, so to say, and they were caught out for bullying in some of the more progressive schools, and they got consequences. And when we questioned as to why did you need to do it, because you're already so popular and you're such a confident kid. And they said that, but we didn't realize that. We thought it was just a little bit of teasing. We were having a little bit of fun, and we didn't realize the impact of it on the other person. And now I do, and I've seen people change through that as well. Those conversations, and that is why I think it is important to look at bullying in a nuanced and in a layered and a wide way, and not just about, oh, there are these bad kids who bully, and so if we punish them, if we ostracize them, if we have strict discipline in school, everything will go away. Because it's a societal thing. I mean, many of these things that are brought into schools or colleges come from the outside world, because people have experienced these things outside in their families, in their communities, and then they imbibe those kind of dynamics within themselves, and they will play it out in whichever setting they are. And one of the, kind of most conducive settings would be school.
So that's very interesting that you brought up the fact that some bullies may not even realize that they are bullies. They might be doing it as a conversation starter, as I've been told by somebody. It was just a way to break the ice, but they didn't realize what they were indulging in was bullying in the first place. When does healthy bullying or these conversation starters turn toxic? So who decides that?
So I don't think there's any healthy bullying. Bullying by definition has a negative connotation. I think it's damaging. And to what extent it damages an individual is, of course, dependent on many, many factors. But by nature, it is something which is an act of aggression. It comes from a power dynamic where, one individual or a group of people feel more powerful than the victim, who is vulnerable, clearly. And they take advantage of that power dynamic. And then they communicate in a manner which is usually aggressive, hurtful, humiliating, right? And that can't be healthy. By any definition, that can't be healthy. Now, how that person processes it, whether they, fight back, whether they go and look for resources, tell their own friends or teachers or parents where the problem is nipped in the bud, then of course it's a better consequence, you could say, than if bullying is dealt with in a more proactive manner by the systems in school, by other people who are sensitive and know about it. Then the consequence and the results of it could be better. But it in no way is positive, as is often thought to be, particularly when bullying becomes institutionalized. When that happens, then we give it another name called ragging. And ragging happens in colleges, and it happens in certain schools, particularly boarding schools. And there are these very, very, over generations kind of codes of conduct laid out that, you have to talk to your seniors like this, and you have to bow your head and look at your third button, and this is how you will be spoken to, and these are the rituals you will do, and you will do your seniors' homework and clean up their bed, and so on and so forth. Now, all that is coming from this power dynamic and a coercive power dynamic, which is obviously for the individual who's the victim mode. It's not going to help them. However, because these systems have been legitimized by people who are also in power, in positions of authority, like school teachers, principals, they'll say, of course, I mean, these are traditions in our school. We do this all the time. And it happens in colleges as well. And when I went to medical college, mine was a college where, again, the ragging system was heavily institutionalized to the extent that all the freshers had to wear a certain uniform all through the day to be able to, kind of mark them out. Even when we went to town, we had to wear that, and we had to cut our hair short and wear a black tie and all of that, So it's very, very institutionalized indeed. And the whole narrative that was formed around it was that, oh, it's so good for you, you'll man up, you'll learn how to take stress and all that. Sure, I mean, maybe there is a handful of them who will, all adversities in that sense can make you become stronger if you learn how to cope with it, right? But on the other hand, there are a bunch of people who get so badly affected by it, where the effect of it becomes very negative in the here and now or in the long run.
I was bullied in school, and I was in a boarding school. It's very easy for people to say, ignore it. I was teased for being dark-skinned. This boy in our class would keep on reiterating it every day till I actually started believing that I wasn't good enough. And I wanted to leave the school. Our interactions with teachers were limited. I asked for intervention with the prefect in charge. And the prefect actually walked into the classroom literally picked this guy up and says, "You're calling her ugly? Have you ever seen the mirror yourself?" I actually felt bad that somebody else was putting him down. But Doc, my question in all this is, it's very easy for people to say, move on, ignore. It's not as easy to ignore till you confront it. And I want both your reactions on this. For me, ignoring it was not a solution. You needed to confront it, you needed to call him out. And I used seniors to address that rather than teachers. Aditya, tell me, what's your experience?
Ignore or stand up, it's definitely impossible for a lot of people. And I think my approach itself was, because people were isolating me, and I'm sure, and a lot of friends thought that this was, uncool or this was not nice. I started talking to my teachers, because in my school, we were less kids per batch. So our teachers had quite a bit more time for like one-on-one and a few person interactions. So I was definitely very close to my teachers, and in break, I used to spend time on my own. And I sort of went in really big into my academics and into my studies. So someone asked, how did you become, this sort of academic oriented person? It's mainly because that's something that I immersed myself into to cope with situations and to be who I wanted to be at the end of the day. But it's very tough for people sometimes to approach people in, positions of authority, sort of pull people up. Some people feel scared that, oh, what if, because a lot of times people have heard of situations where teachers are like, oh, you have to handle it yourself. Why don't you just stand up to them? So I think people do feel really scared. So I think definitely approaching your parents as well, forming that support network in whichever way possible is very important, even though it could be tough, and especially overcoming those initial anxieties, because bullying sort of pushes you down, and then you have to sort of work your way up again, that social anxiety ladder. In some sense, you have to overcome those fears. And it's definitely very tough to approach a person of authority. So how you do it, how you find your sort of coping mechanism, how you find what you feel comfortable at, I think that's really important. That's a really important part of the process.
Oh, that's so well said. No, I must also confess and share with you that I was bullied in school as well, and both in primary and middle school. And just like you, Shruti, for my complexion and my looks to start with, and that I came from a part of the country which was not, which had different, cultural norms, etc. In fact, I was called engine driver for my complexion, right? And I was also not very good in academics, so that also kind of started working on my self-esteem. So I started stuttering in class, stammering and stuttering. And so I would hate to, if a teacher asked me a question, because I just didn't know how to handle it. And when I started stuttering, again, for that I started getting bullied. My own friends would mimic me and and make fun of me because I was stuttering in class, right? It took a while to overcome it, and like you took to academics, I wasn't good in academics, so I took to football, and eventually I became the school captain. So that helped me, because when you're good in sports, you again are held in a certain esteem, and people back off because you're thought to be strong and powerful if you're good in sports, right? So those kind of things happen. So yeah, it is, I think, in a way naive to ask a person who's getting bullied to stand up, because the very reason they're getting bullied is because of the position they find themselves. It's unfair to the person completely, right? Which is why, no doubt, the individual needs to be aware, the victim and the perpetrator, but equally the people who are around them, they need to be aware. So that whole process, like you said, reaching out to teachers, to parents. But one of the fears that the victim of bullying they have, just like victims of abuse, is that who will believe me? They are the powerful people. They will hear them out. They will not hear me. So those kind of deep doubts, seep into your being, and it becomes, doubly hard to be able to go and, stand up for yourself and advocate for yourself. So if other people are there, sensitive, who can reach out to you, can see the changes that are happening in a child who's sensitive, perhaps a little introverted, maybe good in studies, or maybe not so good in studies, and which is why they're getting picked upon. In fact, in one of the research studies that we did, the main reason for what victims as well as bullied said they were picked was due to their looks. So that included question your physical features, your height, and of course your race, how you look. And again, that has such a bearing on who will be chosen. Yeah. The other things like academic performance and stuff like that, how you speak in class, how you can communicate, those things follow. And there are many other things, including religion and minority and caste, in our country. So all those things also become realities. First, of course, they have to learn how to identify it. Because, physical bullying, which is out there and overt, where people are pushing, shoving, or calling names out loudly or obscenities, etc., can be caught out by a teacher or anybody, right, or other peers. But there are other very subtle forms of bullying where you ostracize somebody, you start a rumor, emotional blackmailing, you send covert messages, or you form a group of friends who will then exclude that other person. There are all kinds of bullying that happens, which are very subtle. And those go unnoticed. In fact, the bulk of the bullying that happens, particularly in senior school, is like that. In junior school, it is more to do with the physical stuff, where there's pushing, shoving, kicking, spitting, and stuff like that happens. But as children grow up, they learn that to curb those behaviors. But they haven't yet learned the dynamics of bullying. So that goes on in another form. And that's when it takes more sinister forms, which goes unnoticed. So to start with, people must know what constitutes bullying, right? There are schools who will turn around and say that we don't have any bullying in our school. And you are so taken aback that in today's day, they're not even aware what that means. Bullying is there everywhere, at home, in the workplace, out there in the marketplace. It's there everywhere. And those power dynamics play out in every human gathering that you have, right? And to be aware of it, to be sensitive to it, and to call it out it's a first step. And for that, sensitization, awareness building, what are these very subtle ways bullying can happen, and what does it do to people? These are things that stakeholders must know. Parents must know, teachers must know, the school administration must know, yeah. And of course, there are a range of things that can happen.
You brought out some very, very important points, overt but also covert bullying that happens.
That's right.
It's believed largely that boys get bullied more than girls, but girls, I think, specialize in covert bullying.
Another thing which I've noticed in schools these days is bullying on the grounds of homophobia. And I think that's something which we ignore in Indian societies. We don't talk about it. In many places, they don't even consider it bullying anymore. Like you just call someone gay, and it's it's on no grounds or no basis. And I think that's something that's become really prevalent these days. And I think people find it hurtful because they don't even the kids who are getting bullied, they don't know how to approach it, because that's a subject we really don't approach in our country as such. And even school principals, school teachers, even they find that a very difficult subject to approach. I think that's probably one of the toughest ones these days to talk about, because on physical appearance and on academics, that's been happening for generations now. But this is something which is newer. This is something that's, people find even more hurtful. And even the person who is getting bullied is more or less baffled or just devastated.
Very valid point. Doc, masculine stereotypes and celebrating, the so-called alpha and dissing the one that doesn't fit into that stereotype. Explain that to us, and how can we, society, be more sensitive to that?
Yes, absolutely. So the gender politics, that seeps into every sphere of our life, I think, and school begins to face it from primary school onwards, right? And in the beginning, it is to do with how, being a very tough and outgoing, confident boy versus a shy, timid girl, right? So girly features are usually looked down at. And if a boy is, let's say, sensitive and shy, or in the manner of speaking, is branded as being girly, then that itself becomes a reason for being targeted, yeah? And as you said, Shruti, the being masculine, and to man up, yeah, is a narrative that is so prevalent in our societies that, and in schools, that it becomes a big issue, right? And now, of course, earlier on, it was about being, how girly you are, or, for instance, if a girl is like a tomboy, then often that girl is admired, oh, look how sporty she is. She's so cool, Boys want to hang out with the tomboy girl, right? Yeah. But if a boy is like a girl, or is the manner of speaking is a little feminine, let's say, or the body language is like that, or is, is not very sporty, but is sensitive, or may sometimes have tears when they're in a tough situation, that boy is really looked down upon by the whole student community then, and they're called sissies and girlies and so on and so forth, right? And that is a narrative that starts in primary school. And now, because there is more awareness, and the LGBTQ community has in some ways no doubt raised awareness, but it also has come into the vocabulary. So to, call somebody a faggot and a gay and so many other terms that are used, right, has become commonplace. And the moment you want to get to somebody, you are called those names, right? So name calling, other than the other stuff that, one used to use, like a loser or you're a failure and nobody wants to be friends with you, these kind of things have also started coming in. And although the vocabularies come in, but the sensitivity and the awareness towards, the different hues and ways gender can manifest has not yet sunk in. And again, like you rightly said, it's such a sensitive topic that there are hardly many schools which talk about it openly. Indeed, if somebody is gay, how to address it? If you use the term in a classroom, or if the teacher hears it, she'll treat it as if a bad word has been said. So there's no conversation around it then, right? And again, there is no strategy. Just like there's no strategy with bullying, there's hardly any strategy to, address this whole community which is emerging now, with their own, voice and awareness of their own rights, which is fantastic. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that there needs to be more conversations around it, with openness and without any, awkwardness or shame about it.
Doctor, when somebody comes to you, and if a child has admitted that this is the problem that he's going through, that he's been called these things, how should he address it?
So we talk about internal resources, right? And again, in therapy, it is sometimes assumed that all the work will be done with the individual. At Children First, we don't believe that. We think systemically, right? And there, we look at the family, we look at the peer group, we look at school, and we try and include them in some form or the other, right? So in the beginning, of course, there's some confidentiality associated with one-on-one work, and we don't jump at it. It's not as if the moment this is said, we call up school and parents and tell them that this needs to be rectified, etc. Because that boomerangs back. It actually hurts this individual more. So we actually often, through therapy, etc., help to empower them, prepare them to take these things up themselves if they can, or ask their permission if we as a therapist or we as an organization can reach out to parents, to school, to address it. And again, we get varied responses. Some schools, like I said, will turn around and say, we don't have any bullying in our school, and we are, we don't cease to get shocked by that position. And there are schools who will really be serious about it and say, oh, really, we have to do something about it. Please tell us more. And they will collaborate with the parents and the victim, and then step in. And when they step in, again, there are schools who will say that we don't tolerate bullying, and if there is a bully that is identified, we either suspend or expel him. Right? That's a very typical stance they take. I don't think it helps matters in the long run, because as you said, that the bully, the perpetrator, has also a history, is also a part of the community. But and that particular case that has come to the fore is probably the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that is happening in the community which goes unnoticed. So to throw out that one person is not going to solve the problem within, isn't it? So the best thing to do is to actually open it up and say, then what now is called restorative justice, where you actually eventually, through some preparation, through some sensitization, bring the victim and the bully together, where there's an apology, where there's an understanding by the bully, by the perpetrator, as to what this has done to the victim. Even for the victim to share some of that pain and that hurt, suddenly makes them, sit up and say, oh my God, I'm sorry, I didn't even mean to do this to you, I didn't know how this was affecting you like that. And those kind of things actually help to build the community, to bring it together. So rather than have a punitive stance to bullying, it is vital to address the dynamic of it. And that happens only if we are able to look at this sensitively and in an accepting, inclusive way, even for the perpetrator. We can't keep throwing out people just because they are badly behaved, isn't it? Yeah, they're badly behaved for a reason, and those reasons often lie in society. It's not, it's they have experienced things because the family dynamic or the hierarchy, the patriarchy has been such that that's what they have witnessed as life, and they will learn from it, and they will come back and then play it out again, isn't it? And don't you think it's unfair then to punish them for what they didn't even think about or didn't have a second chance to actually mull over? So to give that chance to the other person, to the perpetrator, while you look after the victim, you support the victim, you include the victim. Many times what happens is, if there are knee-jerk reactions instead, for instance, a victim goes and complains to the teacher takes it to the principal calls the bully, calls the parents, suspends the child, not much is said in the classroom or to other children. The children say, oh, for you, our best friend has gone out of school, and so they then start bullying this kid because, he or she then becomes the target of more anger and oppression from other people. So you can see how that cycle goes. So if we take a punitive stand to it, and if we take only a punishment-oriented approach, then things can go awfully wrong, And a lot of these dynamics and the other bullying that happens. So kids are very smart, and I'm sure we have seen it so many times that once they have realized that you can't do the bullying in front of teachers, you can't do it in certain spaces where there are cameras, they'll do it outside it, isn't it? But till the time you help them to understand the consequences of it, and they begin to take onus, till the time they begin to realize that they need to change, until these changes and insights are that seep in, get integrated into these individuals, nothing is going to change. If they don't bully in school, they bully in the playground or outside school. And we have seen such instances also where the bullying didn't work at school, and this other young man went and got dadas and gundas from the colony and started making threatening calls, sending horrible SMSs to this other kid. We've dealt with things like that as well, So till the time we are able to address it at a systemic level, at a a level where people are beginning to think about consequences of their behaviors, and they feel the motivation to change, the change is not going to be so lasting, I believe.
It's wonderful you brought in this whole systemic, change that needs to be brought about, and not just a punitive one. And that's a very, very valid point. Aditya, have you ever confronted those boys who bullied you? Did they understand what you went through?
I definitely did eventually, but it took years. When I say years, I'd say at least 4 or 5 years before I even approached them again, or before they approached me. And a lot of this actually started when I became head boy, and it took time. Like a few of them did come up and eventually apologize. At the end of the day, I think it took them time to understand as well as to what they were doing, because the initial just immediate punishment approach, as Dr. Sen mentioned, does not work. Or just consoling the victim doesn't work. It has to work in tandem. But at the same time, the punishment doesn't have to be, as Dr. Sen mentioned, I think he said it very well, that when this gang culture begins in the school, and when they say, oh, you did this, or I blame you for this, and then it just starts spreading, I think that's when it takes on a form where the child feels totally encircled by it. Like there's no route to escape. And I think that's where one really needs to engage the whole community in, so that gang culture. And the victim always feels, even scared to approach by, witnesses. For example, the principal will say, tell me someone who saw that this happened. And they'll be scared to even ask, someone who they don't even know for it, because maybe they'll take the gang side, maybe they'll take someone else's side. Those my word against your word sort of stances, and not really engaging with all sides, the victim, the perpetrator, and the witnesses. Like I've heard a lot of teachers say that, oh, the witnesses are as much to blame as the bullying gang. And while I understand that sentiment, I see where that comes from. But maybe the witnesses are also scared at some level that the justice system is not going to work in their favor at some point. That, they're just going to be pulled in and get into this whole mess, rather than there being a system which enables them to solve it, and the witnesses playing a constructive role, they eventually end up playing a destructive role. And you'll see witnesses who are like, no, we're not going to stand up in your favor. So I think that's sort of creating a system which engages these three groups together while helping the victim. And in some sense, yes, I wouldn't use the word punishing, but at least highlighting to the perpetrator that you are wrong. There are no gray areas involved over here. You have to evolve, you have to improve.
Great point you made, that, that it's not that the perpetrator is all evil or all black, right? What they're doing is not okay. And it's important to call that out very, very clearly, that what you did was absolutely not okay. We have zero tolerance towards that kind of behavior. But we're willing to look at the rest of who you are and where you came from, right? Yeah. So we often say in our therapeutic stance that the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. And we separate it out. So if the bullying behavior is happening, then we have to actually look at where the bullying behavior is coming from, rather than completely, throw the individual out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So that's we have something that we have to be very careful about, no doubt. And thanks for bringing that up, because in these negotiations and conversations, even while we are being compassionate towards the perpetrator, we at no time should give the message that what you did was okay. And that clarity has to be there.
The problem is the problem. The person is not the problem.
It's not the problem. Yeah.
Fabulous. That is absolutely fabulous. Talking about systemic change again, Doc, tell us now about the long-term impact of what bullying can do to a person.
So perhaps I'll touch upon the short and the long term, because, in the short term also, when kids begin to respond to the bullying, there may be a kid otherwise who was quite well settled, perhaps a little introverted, was going to school regularly, enjoyed a few bits of things in school, etc., and then starts getting bullied. And again, it could, like I said, could start in primary school or middle school, or sometimes in senior school even. So what you typically see is a fear and anxiety setting in, self-esteem beginning to get eroded. It can then translate into not wanting to go to school, getting physical symptoms of anxiety, such as aches and pains in the morning, wanting to throw up, etc., right? Then crying spells could begin, and then the moods can begin to dip. They could be, panic-like situation, panic attacks, whenever they have to confront a situation where they could get potentially bullied, right? And then it could start affecting their focus and the academics or whatever field they were good at. It can start affecting that. And of course, if the impact is, and nothing is done about it, and the bullying continues, then it can begin to erode their trust and faith towards people and the systems, right? And because people are letting them down, nobody is able to actually support them and help them. And so you then begin to see signs of depression, anxiety in a full-blown manner. So we have seen direct consequences of bullying within weeks and months, and where people have presented with a full-blown syndrome of clinical depression or an anxiety disorder, yeah, and not being able to go to school at all, and completely paralyzed with fear and anxiety. And of course, there is self-harm, and there are many victims of bullying who then begin to, because they are now doubting themselves, there's a lot of self-loathing, guilt, etc., that happens, that I'm bringing this onto me, I don't deserve any better. Then there can be self-harm behavior that can start, they can start cutting themselves, and it's so common these days, and we see some of that as well. And sometimes in extreme cases, when the bullying goes on for a long period of time, we see it as consequences like trauma, where the experience of it is like a huge ongoing life-threatening experience where everything is affected, right? And we have some young people I work with now who are still suffering the aftermath of bullying they faced a few years ago, and which went on maybe for 3-4 years, where there was physical bullying, abuses, maligning their name, spreading rumors, and so much so that even the teachers couldn't see through it, and the teachers sometimes, according to the victim, took the perpetrator's side. So there was a bunch of kids who were bullying this young man, and he just couldn't escape it. And by the time he came out of school, by the time he completed his 10th, he was a wreck, absolutely, emotionally, psychologically. And right now, of course, he's trying very hard to rebuild his self-esteem through various activities and through therapy and all of that. But it's taken its toll in a deep manner. So, and of course, when people get bullied, even if they don't develop a depressive or an anxiety or an eating disorder, they may begin to feel the effect of it later, because they might take that victim position in their close relationships later in life, in their workspaces. They might again feel extremely, they might find it very, very hard to stand up to their colleagues or their bosses. They again might become victims of bullying over there. They might feel marginalized, disrespected, and so on, abused even sometimes emotionally or in so many other ways, right? So the aftermath of bullying can go a long way, and people sometimes who have got bullied severely in school can carry it like traumatic experiences for the rest of their lives,
It's important for all parties really to understand, and even the bully to understand that this could be the impact. And conversations are important to highlight the fact that the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem.
I mean, I agree with everything Dr. Sen said. And I also want to, along with self-esteem, the sort of confidence. Like what I've noticed, at least among children who were bullied in my school, was, even in their posture, the way they looked, the way they sort of presented themselves, the way they spoke in the classroom, the way they spoke in front of their peers. I think that also changes. Like you sort of have these sort of suspicions at the back of your mind that, oh, like if someone approaches you in a nice way, that, oh, are they actually trying to harm me? Maybe they are. These sort of social suspicions which really get ingrained, it really ruins one's social life and the way you start approaching people. And even if you're an introvert, you do like social interactions. I think a lot of people mistake that sort of shyness and introvert
behavior for not wanting social interactions. I think as an introvert, I do not think that's what it is. And I think that's something that people also need to understand. Teachers will just turn around and say, oh, the child's an introvert, right? Obviously, the child is going to look inwards at some point or the other. That's not the way it should be, right? The way it should be is that they have to rebuild their confidence. How do we go about that? How do we have those conversations? And once again, like involving the victim, not just the victim, but also the witnesses. I think the bystanders are someone who really have a sort of traumatic effect on the victim as well, because they're like, oh, if this person didn't stand up for me, I don't think I can be friends with them. And I think that's also something that needs to be handled. How do you bring the victim back in, more confident, with more self-esteem, and to be able to, carry themselves forward?
How did you do it?
So initially I was also like very socially suspicious and like sort of, scared to like approach anyone. And in late class 8, like one girl started approaching me for notes and talking to me, and she used to call on the landline, and I used to be like, why? Why would anyone even want to talk to me at the end of the day, right? I mean, I'm definitely one of the social outcasts in my batch. And it took months for me to realize that, oh, this person does not mean harm. But really, like, it took a lot of realization, a lot of social realization, talking to my parents. My mom was like, hey, I don't think this person means harm to you. And I was like, no one likes me in school. I know that. So definitely, it takes time. I was lucky to find someone like that, and then to obviously find more friends. But for a lot of people, that process is a lot tougher. So how to overcome, definitely you have to find, if not a person, at least an activity that makes you feel comfortable. Like for me, it was academics. So Dr. saying it was sports. For other people, maybe it could be art, maybe going into music. Doing something that makes you comfortable will bring back your confidence at the end of the day. That's something that I've realized. It doesn't have to be a person. Even an activity can help you rebuild your confidence.
I can completely relate to that, because I turned a sporting activity to distract from everything else. And I wanted to be so good at it that people would forget that I faced that kind of bullying. Doc?
Absolutely. I mean, again, thank you for highlighting something which is crucial, because in a sense, self-esteem and self-confidence are, although very closely connected, but a little different. Self-esteem is how you feel about your own self within, and self-confidence is the expression of that in a social domain. And sometimes there are some people who have low self-esteem but are confident outwardly, and they surprise you when they eventually talk about their low self-esteem. And you're absolutely right that people who get bullied, because they're getting humiliated in a social setting, their self-confidence or their ability to face up to the social world becomes that much more difficult. And like you so beautifully highlighted, the fact that once you get bullied and humiliated in front of other people, you lose trust in other people's genuineness, and you begin to doubt pretty much everything that they're saying, or even when they approach you with very positive vibes. And it takes a while to get over it. And so self-confidence is something, again, that can be, as you rightly put, it can come back from things that you do, which will make you feel better about yourself from within. But again, I would re-emphasize this, that when self-confidence can also improve a lot if the system around you can see what's happening to this kid, and they're able to highlight some of their strengths, highlight what they're good at, to give them the opportunities, make them feel safe in social spaces. Again, building those emotionally safe spaces, as we call them, within schools and those places, it's so important. And to bring those kids who seem shy or seem to have had experiences which have made them, vulnerable and weary of actually coming into the spotlight, to help them very gently, through different kind of activities, as you said, which makes them feel a little more confident for those moments, perhaps, to bring them back again, to build that self-confidence. And I do believe that in school, in education, in any institution, particularly in schools, it's the school's business to look at education holistically, and things like self-esteem, confidence, the ability to interact socially should become a part of education.
Look, I have to bring in cyberbullying.
Yeah.
Do you think the impact of cyberbullying, of being completely ignored in social media, could that have the same impact?
Oh yes. And we've seen that so many times. We have had, even in in the popular media, we've had, in news, we've had, instances where somebody was bullying, was hounded, was even sexually exploited through cyberbullying, and eventually took a very extreme step. So the consequences can definitely be very deep, because so much of our young people's world today is the social media. It is such an important part in who you are, right? And there are so many young people who would look for how many messages they've got back, how many likes they've got the first thing in the morning, and they will keep checking it through the day, and their sense of self depends on some of those things, isn't it? And if in that space, which takes so much of their mind space and the sense of self, if there was to be exploitation, if there was to be again bullying and humiliation, you can imagine how difficult that could be. And the other problem over there is that the social space for young people is very exclusive in many ways. Adults don't have any inroads into it. They don't know what's going on over there till it sometimes becomes too late, or unless, of course, the young person has the confidence and the connect and relationship with their parents or somebody else who matters to go and report it. But otherwise, many times this kind of cyberbullying keeps going on and nobody gets to know till it becomes really extreme, and the consequences of that are extreme as well. And that's why it's dangerous. It's dangerous because that social world for young people is so exclusive, and we have little expertise and knowledge to understand that, right? As adults, induce shame, humiliation, guilt. It can strip you of your dignity, and I'm sure that all of us know instances like that amongst even close friends and associates. We do have young people who come to us as a consequence of cyberbullying and what it has done to them. Again, with syndromes like depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, and so on, right? But the essential problem, the way it started, was through cyberbullying and the kind of shaming and naming that goes on. I just wanted to highlight again how important it is to address the role of the bystander, because indeed, if there are other people who are standing around watching and not doing anything, that almost validates the perpetrator's position. It almost says that you have the permission to do this, even without us saying it. If nobody's saying anything, then you have the permission, right? And from the victim's point of view, it almost says to them that perhaps I deserve it. Nobody's saying this. Maybe I am this person that nobody stands up for me, And again, the loss of trust and faith in people, that also goes down in a big way. Therefore, it is important yet again, to emphasize the role of sensitization of the whole community and building these systems where if there are bystanders, they also should know what they can do if they think that what's going on is not okay. Yeah, because people don't know. They're confused themselves. They might have very conflicting feelings, but they also might have fear that if I stand up for the victim, the bully is going to target me next. There are all those kind of things. And also because many of the bullies, many of them, or at least some of them, are popular people, and it is always better to side with somebody who's popular and powerful, and that's what people end up doing without realizing that there can be other recourses, isn't it? But the recourses will come only if there's sensitization and systems built in place. If they know very clearly as an instruction, if every couple of months there are workshops or gatherings in school where it's laid out that this is what bullying constitutes. We are completely against it. We have zero tolerance. If somebody witnesses this, you need to do this. You can be shown videos. You can do role plays. You can do so many different things to help people understand this.
Let's talk about adult bullying. It is very much prevalent in our workspaces, in family situations even.
It's a societal problem. Yeah, it's not just about schools or colleges. It's there everywhere. And you're absolutely right. These patterns form in a manner, these attitudes and prejudices form in a manner that it sits in the mind, and there are lenses that this person will then carry for the rest of their lives, where they will, take that subordinate position, not say a word when something humiliating or bad is said to them. They will make themselves vulnerable, perhaps in ways that are very subtle and inadvertent. On the other hand, in the same space, people who take the bully's position very easily would immediately sense it, and so those, and they will find, therefore, for instance, they say that when a woman goes through domestic violence, they will find partners who will, constantly replicate some of those dynamics. And perhaps some of that is true because of the same thing. It's because, in our own minds, there are these patterns of communication and victimhood, if you would like to call it, that you carry. and you slip into that role very easily, and again, there are people always who are there to exploit you, to take the position of the bully, to feel more powerful. And if you are indeed vulnerable, they'll sense it. So that's what happens. And it's also to do with the kind of hierarchies and patriarchy that is followed in large parts of our community even today. And that is witnessed by children right from the beginning. And again, for each individual, things like, your gender, whether you're a man or a girl or a boy, or again, like you said, how do you look, how capable or intelligent you're thought to be in at home, or in the immediate community, which sort of race, caste, or community you come from, or religion you come from. All those things begin to matter, in these different spaces. And therefore, when bullying or ragging even is played out, in bigger institutions or in workplaces, you'll find subtle hints of it. People carry these kind of, patterns or formats in their mind. They carry these lenses with them for long, long periods to come. And that doesn't mean to say that, go to say that we can't do anything about it. Indeed, we can. Again, if there are conversations, if there's healing that happens, there has to be healing. Firstly, of course, there has to be a confrontation of these realities and not just accept it in the way they are. And that's hard to do sometimes, especially from the position of victims, or from a position where you feel already oppressed and downtrodden, isn't it? To take that position and say, and there are fighters like that. They will from, whether they're, again, people coming from a certain caste or from an educational background where they're first generation learners, they might stand up to this oppression and say, no, we are not going to take this anymore, right? And we will stand up to it. That's one way of doing it. But there are other ways of doing it, which are more gentler, which is like, creating safe spaces, listening, forming groups and coming together and talking about what you've been through, challenging some of the, the given and what we call dominant discourses in the community, in society, that, that these are the powerful people and this is success. And those are the people who we can just overlook and kind of completely ignore. Those are things that we need to then challenge. Those are notions that we have to challenge and say, that's not true, that's not right, These kind of mini rebellions or questionings or questioning the given and the dominant discourse, to be able to stand up, to have the courage to do that, is something that is ongoing, isn't it? And that's something there for life.
The important thing is to identify it, confront it before you move on. You won't be able to move on without it. Aditya, if there are kids who are watching, who are currently being bullied or in the process of trying to get over and confront, what is that one advice that you have for them?
A lot of people, they say, you hear from parents, you hear from teachers, stand up, ignore, all these sort of things. But what I want each person to know is that take your time. It takes time to accept that it's happening. It takes time to process that it's happening. Different people have different ways of processing and different ways of responding. So don't feel that, it's a one-size-fits-all recipe to address bullying. You have to take your own approach. If you talk to your parents, to your teachers, maybe there's a friend who you're really close to, maybe you have an older sibling or a younger sibling who you feel, who you can confide in, or, who's your sort of support system. But each person has to take their own approach. You cannot, just follow, there's no recipe to it per se. And I think that's very important to acknowledge from the get-go itself.
I am so impressed with you.
Yeah,
You brought out one of the major discussions that we've had in the past, where different people respond to stress in different ways. In fact, I've had that chat with Dr. Sen on Zen-Brain, right? So parents and teachers should never forget and never compare two kids and say, usko hua to wo theek tha, dusra ko hua and he succumbed to it, because they react to stress differently. Doc, one last word before we
Absolutely. That's hit the nail on the head. Everybody's temperament is different. Their realities are different. The time they take to understand, process, and deal with stress is different. Which is why I was saying that, in therapy, when a child or a young person brings an incident like this, we don't immediately jump to a formulaic approach of just, dealing with it, but actually work with this individual to figure out what is this person most comfortable doing, so that eventually it works out successfully for this person rather than, fight for a cause. And that's extremely important. So when young people come to me with such instances, or when we do workshops on bullying, we talk predominantly of two things. Internal resources and external resources, right? So resources inside are self-esteem, self-confidence. Am I articulate? Are there talents that I have that I can work with, and so on. And to become aware of it, and in therapy, in discussion, one can draw from what we have within. And then, of course, to be aware as to what you have outside yourself, which means your family, your teachers, your friends, other systems in school. Who can you bank on? Who can you approach? What can you do, etc., and so on, right? And and that again probably helps the person to categorize the different resources they can dip into. And then, of course, like you said, the rest of the process is very dynamic, and it depends on how people respond, right? We sometimes get a very favorable response from school, sometimes not, and we have to then sit back and say, okay, what do we do now? And think on our feet, to keep the faith and say that, and never say die, and say that no, we will find a solution. We will do something about it. If this is something wrong, if it is unjust, if it is traumatic for you, if it is, then we will all get together to do something. So to coming together. Now, what often happens also, and that's important to understand, is that when instances of bullying, etc., get reported, many times school and parents become, they split up, or they get polarized. They take very adversarial positions, and they blame each other and say, it's your fault, you did not. No, this is nothing. You just make a mountain out of a molehill. This happens to all kids, the school might say, and so on and so forth. And so what happens in that crossfire, the individual who's suffering the most gets missed, and probably the trauma or the distress that goes up even further. So it's important to be on the same team. So we have to make a conscious effort to say that whose interest are we serving here, right? And of course, the first person that we are serving is the person who's vulnerable, who suffered the most from here. And then we can begin to connect it to the community, to the perpetrator, and everybody involved. But we have to be in the same team to be able to do that, right? So we often say this to schools and parents: let's come together to work this out together, rather than take polarized positions and blame each other, because that's not going to serve anybody's purpose. And it's definitely not going to help this individual, this child.
So bullying is one of the most common forms of violence in our society. When we rationalize bullying, we become collectively responsible for normalizing it, saying it will only make a child stronger, or by pushing it under the carpet and asking a child to ignore it. If a child is affected, you need to listen, because it could have, as we have discussed today, a long-term impact, even psychological impact on him or her. Remember, every child's response to stress is different. So stop generalizing. If any of you out there would like to share your bullying experience, write to us at zenbraintv@gmail.com. Let's talk about it. And thank you both for this wonderful, wonderful chat. To me, personally, it's been one of the most invigorating, informative, insightful discussion on bullying that I've had. Thank you very much, Dr. Sen and Aditya.
Thank you. Thank you, Shruti, for holding this. Thank you. Thank you, Aditya.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. Thank you, Shruti.